Hey, when it comes to making money from property, one of the ways you can make the most amount of money doing the least amount of physical work is really mastering planning. And when it comes to the planning game, there is an absolute authority and expert in this space that we have as our guest. Jon McDermott is somebody that's been doing planning for a very long time, and we talk about the new government that's coming, some of the changes they're going to be making, and some of the opportunities that's creating. So let's get straight into the podcast.
The thing is, the mayor knows where they all are, because they're all paying vacant business rates.
Yes.
150%, if not more.
Yeah.
Which hurts. Absolutely hurts.
Hurts the owner, but the
Hurts
government
the
quite
owner.
happy
Government quite happy collecting it,
Yes.
but it hurts the owner.
Yeah.
Planning today, sometimes you do have to show a planning officer the way to water.
Yes, yes.
There are some weird planning officers out there that will choose ugly over the better.
Yes.
And if that happens, so be it. And that comes down to that officer choice, that subjectivity, which is difficult to predict and control.
Jon, we have a new tenant at 10 Downing Street right now, and they're making lots of interesting noises around building 1.9 million new homes over the next 5 years. What's your initial thoughts on that?
Oh, new tenants at Downing, that's a really good way of describing our new, brand spangly new red government,
Yes.
or if you believe the rhetoric, reddish purple. The government's always come in with big promises, and with big promises comes very big responsibility to try and deliver. They always come in right at the very start of their tenancy with these big promises. Interestingly enough, their big promise of 1.9 million is actually an upgrade on the big promise that appeared in their manifesto of 1.5 million. But our new tenant at the Housing Ministry has just told us that she needs more, and that 1.5 is not enough. In terms of the big changes, it remains to be seen what they are going to be able to do inside a 5-year period. There's a lot of big promises floating around there right about now. Secretary of State's taking direct action, government tightening up planning rules so that it is more difficult for planning authorities to be so resistive. But how far they will get in their first 5 years is going to be the big test. Most governments in the first tenure, you really need to look at them as a 5-year burn. And because ultimately we're going to be voting them back in, or not, or what have you. Could be a hung parliament, you never know, in 5 years' time. So they've got to make the biggest, most explosive noise in the first 100 days. They've got to try and affect the biggest change in their first 5 years. Otherwise, they're just going to be operating on big promises that they haven't delivered over the following terms.
Yes. So do you think it's from the noise they're making right now, they are likely to make significant changes? Or do you think they're going to be faced with a lot of resistance and it'll end up being little bits of tinkering and tweaking?
I think the first thing we need to see from them is how different are they to the previous tenants at number 10 Downing Street. There's a lot of political thought that suggests that there isn't actually that much difference between the former blue tenant and our present red tenant. A lot of what they're doing is a maintenance of the status quo. It's a maintenance of what we were being promised by the former incumbents. The big challenge will be them putting their stamp on development, planning, housing delivery with a Labour twist, a Labour ethos. And we're in uncertain times at the moment because we've never seen a modern Labour government do that. We've never seen a modern Labour government look at the national framework and go, okay, this is Labour's approach. This is the NPPF, but this time it's got Labour written on the box instead of the Tories. The NPPF is a Tory invention, and we're getting Labour playing with that for the first time. Certain things that were in the Tory manifesto, the Tory lexicon, how they were going to change the planning system. Labour are carrying over. They are promising a national development management policies document. First time England will have a combined document that says this is how development management policy works, or these are the development management policies for England. They are talking about changes to serviced accommodation. That was in their manifesto, legislated for. They're talking about levelling up, but by not using the word levelling up, because that's been deleted, weirdly, from the lexicon. Yes. They're also deleting certain bits that they disagreed with. So we are in these weird, uncertain times.
Yes.
I think the next 6 months are going to be very telling.
Yes. Planning has always been a challenge for many property investors and developers. It's the thing that it's a big question mark when planning pops up. We'll need to look at planning. And in your experience, has there been much change? So maybe give us some background in terms of how you got involved in this space and how long you've been involved. Because I know you look nice and young, but you've been involved in this in quite a long time.
I have got the grey hairs to prove it. No, so 22 years as a town planner.
Okay.
Started off at local government, got into it through a geographical science degree. So as a geographer, you only really have one of three places that you can go. You can try and teach, you can go and work for people like the Environment Agency, or you can go into town planning. I tried teaching and didn't like it very much. It's amazing. You do geography at university and you're all excited about geography and you like it. You go and then try and teach that at GCSE and you realise that 90% of the pupils that were in your GCSE class hated geography and they were just there to mark time. So yeah, tried teaching, didn't like it very much, moved into town planning. So did the next logical thing. Stayed at local authority for 8 years. Actually left through a voluntary redundancy.
Okay.
Quite amusingly, my head of service at the time didn't think I was good enough. I was trying to get shot of me through competency, which was really funny because one of the first jobs I did as a private consultant was smash that authority for 5 HMO refusals with award of costs on each.
Wow.
So, you know, competent, yes, indeed. So after taking voluntary redundancy, I started our own consultancy, now called Town Planning Expert, and I've been doing that ever since. And to date, we're over 3,500 clients that we've assisted on projects. We're still floating about the 90% success rate. National batting average at the moment is about 60%. Not my words, they're the words of the former Ministry of Levelling Up, Homes and Communities and Local Government, but no, that doesn't exist anymore. We're not allowed to call it levelling up anymore. So we bat around about the 90% mark. And
in terms of the type of applications you assist and look at, it's quite broad.
We are general needs, what we describe as GPs. So we're general practitioners, we're general needs planners. We deal with applications as small as I need to insert a light well on a property, all the way up to applications for 60, 70, 80, 90 flats. My biggest is 242 flats as a planning consultant.
Yes. And over the last few years, there's been lots of little bits of changes going on within planning system, processes, more prior approval, etc. What's your view on some of the changes that Michael Gove was focusing on and kind of had pushed through during his time?
Tinkering. So our former Secretary of State was always hamstrung. And it was hamstrung because of how the Conservative Party was organised. So he was hamstrung by the backbench. The problem with the Tories as an entity, and we saw this during the Boris Johnson, Theresa May, we don't need to mention Liz Truss because she wasn't in there for very long, but we saw this. The Prime Minister of the day has to be responsible to the 1922 committee. They have the ability to get shot of the Prime Minister internally inside of the party if enough members of the parliamentary party vote to get rid of them. It doesn't need to go to a National Assembly. It is just a case of we can get shot at them if enough people vote in that direction through a vote of confidence, or a vote of no confidence, as was the case. That always ties the hands of any Secretary of State. Now, as the Tory party got closer to an election, the power of that committee, the power of the backbench, started to wane off, because ultimately their focus changed. The focus has to change to, we have to win an election. We've got to get 𝗍𝗃 back in power somehow. Not entirely sure how, but we've got to get 𝗍𝗃 back. Fine. How do we do that? And we started to see the rhetoric change. So instead of being more conservative, more tinkery in terms of the changes they wanted to do to planning, we started to see more fundamental structural shifts being proposed. Now, ultimately, the biggest of those shifts were, I want to use the term, rug pulled by their own Prime Minister.
Okay.
Because they were timed to hit us now. So they were timed to hit us during the summer, when we would have been preparing for, and in the run-up to, a October-November election. For whatever reason, the Tory party, the Tory leadership, decided that they weren't going to do a October-November election, and they were going to go early. That then rug pulled a lot of the changes that were in consultation, a lot of the big permitted development shifts, which are now sitting on the statute books as consultation done.
Right.
Does Labour want to play with these or not?
Okay.
But a lot of the stuff that Michael Gove did was tinkering.
Right.
A lot. It was changing words, tinkering around the edges. Nothing big, nothing structurally different, nothing that would really revolutionise how planning worked. More a case of trying to make things happen, but always with a view over his shoulder.
You've heard the phrase, your network is your net worth, and you'll also hear it in this particular podcast as well. That's because people in property recognize the importance of being connected with other people. Property is a people business, and that's the reason I've been running a networking event for over a decade now. Each and every month we bring like-minded people together, an opportunity for you to come along and meet some of those people, and also learn from other people on the stage, learn from myself as well. So make sure you book onto the next meeting. We're on the third Tuesday of every month in Birmingham. Now let's get back to the podcast. So what do you think the new Labour government have been saying in these early stages that could lead to significant changes in planning? What sort of things have they been talking about?
So it's a great question. Let's just focus on a few key messages that they're pushing out there. The first is this drive to deliver housing. And it is a massive drive to deliver housing. They've jumped their yearly estimate from 300,000 a year to 370,000 a year.
We've never met the 300,000 target historically.
Last year it was 150 or thereabouts. Year before that was 129,000. So we've never, and that was the Tory target, 300,000 a year. We've never been able to hit the 300,000 as a country. Certainly not pre-war. And certainly not in the latter half of the 20th century. So we are being given these figures, this target, this rhetoric that we need to achieve. The next thing they're saying is that planning is key to that. That planning authorities are key to that. They're almost pushing the responsibility for success or failure, the latter having more consequences than the former, onto planning authorities and saying, no, you guys pushing paper, doing these decisions, getting things right, getting things wrong, whatever, you're responsible for this. This is your back. It's not a developer who gets the actual development consent sorted out. It's the planning officer that approves the development consent. It's not the developer who tells their builders where they can and cannot build. It's the planning officer that says to the developer, you can build in this location, you can't build in this location. So they force that message onto planning and say, no, it's your responsibility to sort this out. Planning is key to this. The next noise that they're making is all about how they're going to affect this structural change. And it requires a structural change in the system and a mental change in the system. I'll deal with both. The structural change focuses on encouraging developers to build in areas where they want to have a presumption, a heavy presumption in favour. The Tories tried to do this way back in 2019-20, pre-COVID, where they were talking about brownfield passports. So certain sites would have an instant buy. It would just be a case of, we'll just deal with finer detail, but principles secured, almost like an American zoning system.
Okay.
The Labour Party are talking about that heavily. They're talking about their changes to the current framework being a precursor to passporting, which actually would be a very big structural shift.
So just to be clear on what you've just said there, so is that like you should be able to build unless planning say you can't for some reason?
Yeah, that's changing the status quo dramatically. So at the moment, the status quo says planning permission should be granted unless local policy or material considerations dictate otherwise, right? But the operative word is should, having regard to local plan. The brownfield passporting approach would change that to planning permission must be granted unless substantial reasons dictate otherwise, right? And that there is an automatic presumption in favour of that planning permission being granted. Now that's restoring the system back to pre-𝗵𝗵𝗹, where there was an automatic presumption in a town or a city, planning permission should be granted, must be granted, unless a planning authority can come up with a decent reason as to why not. But they're proposing to expand that out to all brownfield land, which actually makes a bit of sense. So that is the sort of really big shift in planning thought, and then in terms of the effect that will have on hearts and minds of our planning officers, that remains to be seen. I think that's the great missed trick here, in that ultimately it still remains, and I used to describe them as the squidgy carbon-based life form who determines the planning application, but they are still the people who have to push these things through. There needs to be a change in mindset affected at planning authority level, where the default answer is not no. The default answer has to be yes, and that's what they're proposing to do. In theory, what the brownfield passporting will do is change the default answer from a default of no to a default of yes.
Yeah. That would then encourage developers to want to take on sites to then develop, because you're taking some of the risk and uncertainty away that currently exists in the system.
Yeah, and that's the important thing. Planning, it doesn't matter what level of planning application you play with, all the way down to basic permitted development. If a planning authority wants to try and find a reason, they will want to try and find a reason, right? And that is part of the ingrained risk. How much risk depends on what you're doing, but there is always that ingrained risk. And what this government needs to do is take some of that out. I need to reduce subjectivity, and they need to alter the perception of planning, so that the default answer for a planning officer should be, I want to approve this. I didn't get into planning when I first started out being a planner to just say no to stuff. I got into planning to make an actual change to the city that I lived, loved and worked in, which was Portsmouth.
Yes.
I still want to make an actual change to that city every time I do a piece of work in Portsmouth. I deeply enjoy it. But it's weird that the planners that I'm up against, the other side, don't seem to have that same drive.
Do you think that's been a change over time, or is that's just always been the case with planners?
No, it certainly hasn't. It certainly hasn't. It's been a mindset change that's occurred over the course of years. It's human nature at the end of the day to want to take control of something or a process or what have you and put your stamp on it. Straightforward human nature. But it is also right to say that when you become a planning officer for the first time, it's one hell of a power trip.
Mm.
You know, you're suddenly told, oh, by the way, here's some planning applications, and you get to decide their destiny. Ooh, that's big and scary, and that's fun.
Mm.
It's also one of the most stressful jobs imaginable.
Mm-hmm.
The burnout rate of planning officers is incredibly high.
Where do the stresses come from, do you think, in that role?
Everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So as a junior planning officer coming into work for the first time, you probably hit your desk and you're lumped with 60 to 100 planning applications, all for minor stuff. Now, you might think minor stuff is minor. No, minor stuff is people's extensions, their homes. So probably the most emotive of all planning applications. And I was on other podcasts and I've said, planning is a role where you are never right to everyone. You cannot please everyone. Right? It's impossible to do so.
By its very nature, that's going to be somewhat unhappy. Yeah.
You know, you'll have a family who desperately need a loft extension for their growing family. They can't move anywhere else. Or they might desperately need an annex for their grandma. Or they might desperately need a downstairs bedroom for their disabled son or daughter. There might be actual reasons why, and yet you've got their neighbours on both sides explaining to you that if you allow this extension to be built, their lives will be ruined. So you're facing the emotive of one versus the emotive of two.
Yes.
And it's that equation that ultimately leads us to a mindset of refusal, because the needs of two scream louder than the needs of the one.
Yeah. It makes sense when you explain it that way, yeah.
And we often see that. I was dealing with an application in Wigan that is now at appeal for an HMO, very simple HMO, 5-bed house to a 5-person HMO. You'd think, well, there's nothing wrong with that, 5 to 5. Yet the neighbours were screaming, properly and truthfully screaming. And they were screaming to such an extent that nearly 100 objections then manifested on this file. And you're looking at it as a planning consultant thinking, okay, well, I think I know where this is going to go, because the calculus of decision making is now working against my client. These people are all saying the same thing, which is we shouldn't be approving HMOs in Wigan. They make noise, they make disturbance, they're bad, they're bad, they're bad, they're bad, they're bad. Even though a 5-bedroom house as a family can be occupied by a generational home, say.
Yes.
The calculus of decision making means that that planning officer is going to start to look at that very negatively very quickly. And ultimately I could have written the decision for them, which is the application is refused, noise, general disturbance, and then they also started talking about use and activity in the back garden being over what they would expect for a 5-bedroom family home, none of which demonstrable, all of which challengeable at appeal. But that is the calculus of decision making. That's the many then influencing the one.
So it's pushing that responsibility to somebody else then. So they've said no.
Yeah.
The vast majority are happy.
Yeah.
But actually there's no real legitimate grounds for that having been refused.
Correct.
And so now you have to go through a process of appealing that decision.
Yeah.
And there's only one place in the country that manages all the appeals. So you go into a queue there, and then somebody hopefully takes a more impartial, sensible look at it.
Yeah.
And think actually there's no reason they should have been refused. Yeah. And it's approved. But there's no consequences on the planning officer that refused it in the first place.
No.
And time delays, cost implications.
Correct.
None of those things are considered.
No. They're outside of the system. Planning operates, in theory, in the public good, in the based on public need. It has no interest in private. So the private effect on a purchaser, on a vendor, on your funding stream as a developer, that's irrelevant as far as planning is concerned.
Yeah, none of those things are considered. What do you think really should be changed in planning for it to be a more fairer, robust, smoother system for the vast majority, not necessarily just for developers?
I think what planning desperately needs is a reset. If I'm brutally honest, planning needs a reset. Planning of the 1950s was excellent. If you look at planning applications in the 50s, they went through smoothly. They were dealt with by technicians, not officers.
Mm-hmm.
They were based on policy. And it was a policy compliance approach.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost like building regulations.
Right.
You had a sequence of policies that told you what you couldn't do, and you had a choice as a developer. You either followed the policies and got a quick and easy and simple planning application through,
Mm-hmm.
or you chose not to follow the policies because you thought you knew better and you didn't get anything. You didn't get anywhere.
Mm.
That was planning of the 50s. The problem is today, in our system, we've built in subjectivity, heavily built in subjectivity and interpretation. And when you build in subjectivity and interpretation, what you end up getting is the decision-making processes of today, where it's someone's opinion.
Mm.
Planning is therefore difficult to predict. You
Luck of the draw.
You can't look at one officer and say they're going to make the same decision as another officer. You can mitigate your risk, moderate it, but the risk ramps itself up.
Mm-hmm.
So what planning needs today is a reset. In my view, it needs a setback to, we have policy, we're going to follow policy. That policy tells us how to read it, we're going to follow that. There's no interpretation, there's no special, oh, this is the way we do this in Winchester, or this is the way we do it in Chester, or this is the way we do this in Tunbridge Wells. It's just we have a set standard. Now, hopefully, it is my great hope that when we see the National Development Management Policies document come out of Labour, what we get is a set of nationally binding DM policies that everyone uses, and everyone uses the same interpretation for. Because I'm hoping, I remain forever hopeful, that what we'll get with that document is, this is what this policy means, and this is how to read it.
Mm-hmm.
Not this is the policy, go and think about it.
Yeah, interpret it your own way.
This is what it means, and this is how to read it. Because if we get that, then we will get the Great Reset. We will get everyone working off the same playing field.
Create some standardization, yeah.
And then you won't have the risk of one authority and another authority, say Tunbridge Wells and Tunbridge and Malling, which back onto each other and even have the same name, right? Interpreting planning in completely different ways, because one is Royal Tunbridge Wells and the other one is Tunbridge and Malling.
So with the changes do you think this government's talking about rolling out, and for example the vast number of homes we need to build, do you think that will happen with the general changes in policy, and that smaller developers are going to try and step into the shoes of getting that done? Or do you think it's a case, right, we just need to build 5 new towns in the country, or
Even the new towns proposal isn't going to scratch the surface. Not in the time period that it takes to get a new town built. Fareham Borough Council on the south coast has been trying to build Wellbourne, which is a new village, 5,500 new homes, for a number of years. It's taken to this point about 20 years from concept to planning document to development starting for Wellbourne to emerge. And even then there are compromises afoot, because they're talking about whether or not they need to put a new junction in on the motorway, and that will add more time and delay. So new towns on their own does nothing. They take too long, they take far too much local authority time to determine, to deal with. And in reality, we don't get our major forms of development from big sites like that. We get our major forms of development from smaller sites. The vast majority of our development in this country happens on smaller, more compact sites in towns and cities. And that is more akin to what the government, the previous government, the government before that wants to do. You know, we have our wonderful developed areas. Take the Jewellery Quarter in Birmingham, for example. Massive vacant sites still there, just sitting, waiting. Those are the things that we should be thinking about first, because ultimately they achieve everything we want to achieve. Redevelopment of our cities, of our towns, in the most sustainable locations where people can live, work, thrive, survive and prosper with everything they need on their doorstep.
Yes. How much of the new homes do you think should or could come from the repurposing of existing buildings?
A huge amount. It's difficult to put a figure on it, but an application I've just had determined by 𝗚𝗲𝘁, which we're going to have to go back on because they didn't like the fire risk assessment, which isn't really planning but was put into planning following Grenfell, is a beautiful big building, former banking offices, and is going to generate 64 dwellings.
Okay.
Right in the town centre, with its own car parking and everything else. We can generate a huge amount. It's actually quite sad for me as a planner to walk around major cities. So every once in a while I have to go into London. I know the Birmingham people don't like talking about London that much, but we're going to have to talk about it just briefly. You walk around central London and you just go into any of the side streets off the main thoroughfares and you see vacant buildings. And you're asking yourself the question, why? Why is it that London has a massive great housing shortage that is getting worse?
Yes.
Getting worse. That, and yet the Mayor of London is more than content to allow these vacant buildings to just persist. He's more than content to take the vacant building business rates off them every single month. But he's not content to actually do something about it. And that's the great sadness.
Yes. What sort of things are you thinking that could be done with those, just as an example of those?
Well,
what should the mayor be doing with regard to those type of buildings, do you think?
The stupid thing is the mayor knows where they all are, because they're all paying vacant business rates.
Yes.
150%, if not more.
Yeah.
Which hurts. Absolutely hurts.
Hurts the owner, but the
Hurts
government
the
quite happy collecting.
Government quite happy collecting it,
Yes.
but it hurts the owner.
Yes.
So why isn't the mayor doing what the Planning Act tells him to do? Why isn't any metropolitan mayor doing this? I know we have a metro mayor in the West Midlands, there's a metro mayor in Greater Manchester. Yes. They all have the same data. So why aren't they all doing the same thing? Which is going to those owners and saying, work with us. Just work with us. We'll help you. Let's find a purpose for this building. Let's find a home for this building. Let's make this building useful again, rather than leaving it to rot.
Yes.
Most of these buildings are old anyway. They can be tremendously stunning. I was walking up and down your road earlier before we met. There's an absolutely gorgeous former cinema
Yes.
just up the road from here, where they've ripped down all of the back, and I'm looking at it thinking, there's a vacant site there.
It burnt down.
It burned down.
Yes.
Let's go there. It disappeared.
Yes.
Right. So it's got part of the back's gone, and now the front is a car park.
Yeah, it's just a front facade that's there. Yeah.
Yeah. And I went to the other side of the road, and you can nosy over the hoardings.
The big site at the back.
And there's a huge site at the back because it was an old cinema, and they're massive.
Yes.
And you look at sites like that and go, but you could restore the front. You could make that spectacular. You could build off the back of that. You could make something really beautiful, really purpose-built. You could generate dwellings for this city. But no one's doing that because they're more content keeping it as a car park.
Yes. It's encouraging the owners to do something with it.
Yeah.
And supporting them in doing something with it, rather than just leaving it as an empty building.
As an empty lot, yeah.
Because some people will be hurting financially with having these properties empty. They might be trying to do something with them. And others are just parking cash in buildings. It's just case, well, we own the building, it'll go up over time. We're not really bothered. The site is valuable. But it's trying to persuade those people to do something with those sites. Yeah. You said in big cities, you see all over the place. I remember having a conversation with an officer from a local authority very close to Birmingham. I won't name which one it is. And we were talking about empty homes, and they were responsible for the empty homes officer for that area, along with other roles they had as well. So that wasn't their sole role. And during the conversation, it struck me, his objective was just to get that list down. He didn't really care what happens with it. It's the case we've got so many thousands, we just want to get that list smaller. That's my objective. So as long as they can come off my list, I don't really care what happens to them. And that's so the focus was just shrinking the list as opposed to how can some of these be created and facilitated. And I'm sure in that local authority there were some grants available as well to bring some older buildings back into use. But it's just connecting all those pieces together and encouraging them, and so much more development could happen.
It really is. It's the same with commercial properties. There's a empty commercial properties list that every council has to maintain. They all have to know where these empty commercial properties are, and that list is public. They have to give it to you on an FOI, unlike the empty homes list. But there's no one willing to do anything about it. Their duty is to compile the list and keep it up to date, not look at the list and go, why?
Yeah.
And it's that why, that question, that leap of logic or thought beyond, okay, we've got this amount of empty properties, empty commercial properties, and we've got this amount of people on the housing waiting list, and we've got this need for housing. So how do we connect the dots? Oh no, I don't want to think about that. All I need to think about is walking around these properties every year and compiling my list.
Yes.
And actually that's the great, it's almost like we've gotten into the habit now of being stuck in our lane, stuck in our silo, and unwilling to look over the edge and change direction. And that's what I think is hurting us. So going back to your original question, how many properties, how many units can be brought forward by just looking at our vacant commercial and residential stock? The answer is a huge number.
Yes.
Just by thinking to ourselves, 1 minute, how do we use the resources that we have rather than having to disappear off into the countryside and use green land?
So PD and prior approval first came to my awareness, more kind of prior approval, was it 10, 12 years ago when office to residential started becoming a little bit of a thing?
Yeah.
And that was the first repurposing of commercial buildings that I started to see into residential, and there's a huge uptake at the time. After a little slow start, there's lots of people jumping onto that bandwagon, if you like. And I think that created lots of homes. There's probably questionable in terms of some of the quality and size of some of those, but it created it created that effect of lots of homes being brought into the community. And there's been lots of changes in prior approval over the recent years. Do you think that's a more safer route for people to be following? Is that something people should be considering? Or when you're looking at a site, it should be a case of let's just go straight in with the planning application, what we want? Should they be exploring other routes first?
It's a whole system. So you need to look at it through the lens of the whole system. There are people out there who just tell others, stick with prior approval, stay in there, stay in your lane. That's fine. If you're able to systemize it and get it to work properly, then great, stay there. There are others like myself who ask people to think more holistically about a building, and what do you need to do through a planning application? What can you do through prior approval? What do you not need consent for? Using the whole of the system to work together. And there are others who just smash in a planning application because we're just smashing a planning application to see how it writes. The latter is not a successful way of using planning today. Neither in reality is the former. The sticking inside a prior approval just on its own is always a compromise, but it's a compromise on both sides of the equation. You're compromising your own development because you're stuck inside a process that is rigid and unyielding when you need to make changes to a building.
Because there's no flexibility within it. So for example, like with windows or doors and stuff on a building,
you're stuck
whatever's
with what
there
you
is there, you're not able to create new ones within that process.
No, you have to shift gears and go into a planning application. Similarly, inside a planning application, if you're just throwing everything at an application, you're just sticking it in a planning application, you're then running a risk, because the risk factors then go up that the planning authority will find a reason. If you look at things more holistically and say, right, what do I need? What can I do now? Don't need consent for. What can I do under a permitted development application? What can I do under prior approval? What can I do under a planning application, and how do I bolt all those together, then you're thinking about buildings and spaces in a much more strategic way.
Yes.
And you're breaking your risk factors down into the component parts. It may take a little bit more time than just smashing in a compromise prior approval. It might take a less time than having to go through an appeal. But it's looking at the whole of the system, going, what do I need and where? And that, I think, is how people should be using planning today.
Yeah.
Certainly how we encourage our clients.
Yes, I think that's interesting when we look at, for example, when we're doing HMOs, certainly before Article 4 was in Birmingham, our approach would be, we would take a family house and under permitted development, we put a biggest extension we can at the back, we do the loft conversion at the back, put the dormer on at the back, all these things under permitted development. I think, right, okay, so we can build all those as a family house, and then we change its use to a HMO at that stage. It becomes a HMO for 6 people. And then we put an application in to have a 7th person at the property. So doing these things in little bits, as opposed to just going in right at the beginning and say, right, I'm going to take that family house and turn it into a 7-bedroom HMO, which is probably going to, cause an uproar with the neighbours. And it makes much more sense to look at what's the opportunity at each stage, rather than just trying to go in with the final thing we're trying to achieve from the offset.
Absolutely. It's how we currently operate with our clients in Southend. Southend have got very used to that process now. They like seeing applications in steps. So they like us to do a certificate of lawful use to take a house into a 6-person HMO. Lovely. They're quite happy with that. We get good decision making through. And then we go in for the 7th or 8th person. And they're happy dealing with that. And they've taught their committee that that is an appropriate way of doing things. We've seen that whole process then evolve on the south side of the Thames Estuary in Medway, where we now have a head of service making the logical leap of thought to say, okay, you're doing these applications, but you've taught us how this works. So now can we have a discussion with you about not doing the intervening steps, but going for one application over the top, and we will accept that your intervening steps are available to you.
Yes.
Because you've shown us that they are, or you've taught us that they are.
Yes.
That's a very forward-thinking head of service.
Yes.
But that's come through a whole host of applications in sequence where they've looked at what we're doing and connected the dots themselves. We wouldn't have been able to do that with them if we hadn't have done...
Yes.
And certainly our clients wouldn't have been able to do that with them if they hadn't have done the stepped approach first and shown them the way. Planning today, sometimes you do have to show a planning officer the way to water.
Yes, yes. It makes me think about a number of times where we've put planning applications in for, let's say, for an extension at the back, and we put an ugly one in under permitted development and a planning application in for a nicer looking one. And so it's almost a case saying, look, we can build this ugly one anyway if you refuse it, but this is a nicer approach. We think it's much more attractive building it in this way, but it's still hit and miss. There's still no certainty that actually a planning officer will see sense in what we're saying and say, don't build the ugly one because we can see this one works better.
It's what we describe as the deal or no deal approach. Many other television shows are available. But the deal or no deal approach in terms of planning practice, where you are showing them what can happen under PD, you are showing them a betterment through a planning permission, and you're asking the planning officer to choose. There are some weird planning officers out there that will choose ugly over the better.
Yes.
And if that happens, so be it. It often means you actually get a bigger extension, weirdly. Or you get something that does a bit more for you because you're often making a compromise to make it prettier. You do find there are planning officers out there who choose not to do that and choose to take the better solution. It's all down to, and that comes down to that officer choice, that subjectivity, which is difficult to predict and control.
And we touched on Article 4 earlier, and predominantly the removal of your permitted development rights to turn a family home into a HMO. And this is slowly, we're starting to see more and more local authorities rolling this out. Do you think this is something that will just slowly happen across the country? All local authorities will go through this process, and how Article 4, do you think some are not interested in going down that route?
It very much depends on the planning authority in question and what stresses they're feeling.
Okay.
Let me just give a couple of practical examples here. Take London Borough of Merton, for example. They attempted an Article 4 borough-wide and were told by the then Secretary of State, Michael Gove, that they could only have half of their borough.
Right.
Because they hadn't demonstrated to the Secretary of State why they needed to go borough-wide. That is the new way of dealing with Article 4, is you can't just slap an Article 4 on the entire borough. It has to be the smallest possible area. You have other authorities who look at their HMO problem and go, well, actually, we don't have an HMO problem at all. So take Cornwall Council, for example. They have a university city at Truro. They have major university campuses, but they only have one Article 4 area in 𝗚𝗏𝗁.
Right.
Which is the most weird place to put an Article 4 against HMOs, because 𝗚𝗏𝗁 isn't really an HMO area. It was something that the town council asked for. But the rest of the county pretty much is free of that kind of restriction. It really does come down to the pressure that they're facing. Imposing an Article 4 is not a planning decision. Planners universally don't like them. There's a really good reason why. It's extra work. When you put an Article 4 on, you're removing the permitted development right, which means that application must go before planning. It must have a planning permission. An Article 4 is predominantly a political decision. It is the councillors, the elected members, the trying to use not to use the word numpty. I'm sure they're all lovely people, but the people you and I vote for to put in power in these places, who are being told by their constituents, hey, I need you to sort this out. And they then put political pressure on, and that then forces an Article 4 to occur.
Yes.
It's very rare that you see an Article 4 come for any other, a major structural Article 4 like removal of change of use. It's very rare that you see those come as a result of planning officers making that judgment call. Now, conservation area Article 4 is different, because that's the conservation officer saying, no, this area is special because of this set of reasons.
Yes.
And we're starting to see that set of reasons erode, so we need to intervene. But the major Article 4s, no, they're typically political in nature.
Yeah, in Birmingham, we used to have Article 4 around Birmingham University originally, and then it was rolled out citywide. And I remember a few years ago having a conversation with the former head of planning. He'd stepped down a few months earlier when I was having this conversation with him, and he'd pushed through Article 4, and we were having this conversation, very proudly telling me that he did it, Article 4 through Birmingham. And I was asking, what was the primary reason for creating that? And the answer was the one I was expecting, which was antisocial behaviour, all these problems you have with HMOs. And so, well, actually, the vast majority of problems in HMOs, in my experience, tends to be around social housing. And that's where you see the vast majority of these type of problems in HMOs. And so what's happened in Birmingham, although we now have Article 4 citywide, the problems in HMOs have increased significantly, because most of the accommodation that's HMOs now is exempt. So there's still lots of HMOs appearing, but now they're exempt because they're used for social housing, and the problem's only increased. And so when I was having this conversation with him, he'd never thought about it in that way. So I'm happy to take you to any of our HMOs and you tell me where you see a problem. Because the
perception of the problem is greater than the problem itself.
You think this is where all the problems are. Well, actually, that wasn't the case. And now they've taken a tank to crack a walnut.
In Portsmouth, in the city of Portsmouth, the HMO problem was political. And it was led by the then leader of the council, a gentleman called Gerald Vernon Jackson. It started off when I was still a planning officer. And what they were concerned about in particular was an area of Southsea called the Ladder. It's an area of terraced streets that, if you look at it on a map, it looks like a ladder with rungs. And that area in particular was 90% HMOs. All the HMO landlords had clustered there. And it was all student HMO. And yes, it is fair to say that student HMOs don't tend to be the absolute best run. And they tend to have the lowest level, or one of the lowest levels, of landlord oversight on them. Landlord's happy just taking rent, leaving it to an agent who does a 6-month check, but that's it. And that was the perception of the problem. But in dealing with that problem, they decided to roll the Article 4 out citywide into areas of the city which had no problem. So areas of the city where the HMO threshold, the HMO density was incredibly low, near zero in some locations. But they rolled it out citywide because of a perception of a problem in a very specific part of the city. The problem always occurs when you choose to do that as a planning authority. You're right, it's a sledgehammer to crack a nut. Yeah. Absolute sledgehammer. Especially when you don't then have a policy to back up what's going on. But what also, if you choose to go the other way, which is go zonal, so take Peterborough, for example. Peterborough have just gone Article 4 in 4 of their district areas. Okay. All that's occurring is the HMO landlords have clicked onto that quite quickly, and they're buying properties in areas that aren't covered by the Article 4. So they're naturally moving, because Peterborough is such a compact city, they're moving their business from inside the Article 4 to just outside of it. And in some cases, literally the opposite side of the line. Yes. Because they can. And they're creating a 6-bedroom HMO there. Because they can. Hilariously, one of mine was refused by the council, a 6-bed HMO, to going to a 6-bed 7-person HMO, essentially double occupying some of the rooms, to allow couples to live there. It was refused by the council on grounds of car parking, because a 6-bed HMO generates the same parking need as a 6-bed HMO, but there was a difference in people on highways, so they could grab hold of it. It was reported in the evening news in Peterborough. It flashed up on my phone. So, oh, HMO refused. I bet I recognise that one. Click on it. Oh yeah, it's Padham Road. Yeah, I know that one. I've got to write up that appeal this week. With the news exclaiming victory. Yes. It won't be victory. Yeah. Because the planning inspector will look at the judgment call and say, right, your parking standards are based on bedrooms, not people. So 6 bedrooms to 6 bedrooms, what's the difference? Yes. But perception is worse than the harm itself.
And in Article 4 areas, what's your thoughts on going in with a new, trying to create HMOs in Article 4 areas?
We do it all the time. And we follow the policy. Yes. So in Article 4, policy compliance, understanding the policy, following it, reading it, following it, and applying it is critical. We've got one to do in Bedford. One of my colleagues is doing it, which is a case where the owner created an HMO without applying for planning permission and is now having to ask for forgiveness. And what we're having to do is make sure that the HMO absolutely follows the 4 principles that Bedford have for creating HMOs. As long as we can prove that he's following the 4 principles, we will be able to rescue that situation and get planning permission for it. But policy compliance is absolute key. They have all of the HMO Article 4 areas have a policy that tells you effectively how to get planning permission. Right? If you do this, we will grant consent. They have to be worded that way. Planning permission will be granted so long as you meet these criteria. Fine. Positively worded. Follow it. That's what we do all the time. And that's how we get our HMOs approved, is that we're following policy, ticking boxes, because that type of policy is the easiest to follow.
Because it's more prescribed, these are the things that we want. Yeah.
And if you're uncertain about which policy it is, or if you're uncertain about how they're applying it, then the simple solution is to do your homework. Go and have a look at some decisions. Go and watch a committee. Planning committees are all on YouTube now, pretty much, with the exception of Bedford, weirdly, because they have their own system. Bedford have always had their own system for doing pretty much everything, but everyone else uses YouTube, right? And you can watch them. You can see what the councillors are talking about. You can see what they're deciding, what weight they're applying. You can see how the planning officers are presenting it, what they're looking to support, what they're not looking to support. Follow the positive. Don't try and replicate a negative. So look at things that have been approved. Why were they approved? Every decision has an officer report attached to it, which tells you exactly why the officer came to the conclusions they did.
Yes.
Even if they make no sense, they tell you exactly why. They have to do that. Follow that train of logic and repeat a positive. Don't try and repeat a negative.
Yes. So you could be looking at planning applications on the planning portal, ones that have been refused and ones that have been approved, reading the reports from the planning office as to why it's been refused or why it's been approved, and then building your understanding, because planning really is an area of law. Yes. It's a legal system, it's a legal framework. It's understanding what the framework is. I think the challenges, as we touched on earlier, it can be interpreted in different ways, and the planning officer's views are ultimately what matter, and they make the decision. I guess just taking it a step further, if we have a planning officer allocated to a case, because you can't pick and choose who it is when it goes into the system, whoever picks it up or whoever it's allocated to. But if you look at some of their previous applications and what sort of things that they like or don't like, and maybe get a conversation started fairly early with them about how you might be able to tweak your application to please them.
You're then playing the planning officer against themselves. It's like taking Garry Kasparov on and putting him against Garry Kasparov. The whole point about doing that research is you're looking for consistency in decision-making behaviour.
Yes.
You're looking at how officers approach things in a certain way. You're looking at how the system is working in that particular district. And importantly, you're not making the assumption that just because Wolverhampton deal with HMOs in a certain way, the adjoining authority of Sandwell will deal with HMOs in the same way. One of the things that we tell clients to do is to learn the authority that they're operating in and stay there. Yes. Don't try and scatter themselves over a wide area, because they will do themselves a disservice. They will never learn the authority that they're behaving in or operating in. They will always they will get confused messages from multiple authorities. So try and stay in one place, learn the authority, watch what's happening, and you'll get a much better approach through the planning system as a result. You'll get a much more consistent approach to the planning system as a result. Some of our clients in Southend, I don't need to tell them how to run a planning application. I just get instructions from them, which is lovely. Yes. Saying, you've taught us before, can we just do it this way, this way, this way? Are you cool with that? Yes, I'm cool with that. Off we go. And I get a set of plans through, and I can deal with the applications in a very smooth way, because I'm not having to teach them how to do planning for that particular authority, because they know how to do planning in that particular authority. They need me as the intermediary, the agent, to put the application in and make the system work.
It can feel like this is a lot of work, but then when we think about there's many different ways to create profit, make money from property, this is one of the few areas where you do very little, if any, physical work, and you can create quite a significant uplift in the value of a site, a building, a property by going through this process. So it's certainly worth the effort and the energy of learning it. I guess one of the things when people are exploring planning, they maybe are unsure about is the type of professionals that they need to support them through that. So you might have someone that can create some drawings and say, I can do this for you. There might be an architectural consultant, architectural technician rather. It could be a RIBA architect. It could be someone who's a consultant, previous town planner like yourself. Who fits in where in these applications, do you think? How do we assess who do we need to have on board and at what time?
So that's about looking ahead and understanding who you're probably going to need in your power team from the outset, and who you're going to call upon. I like to think of a planning power team as a football team, only a very small one. So you almost need to look at your range of consultants as subs on the bench, to use the football vernacular. It works for rugby as well, weirdly, and cricket. But anyway, you need to look at us as subs on the bench. When do you need to call on us? swappers in, swappers out, that kind of thing. When it comes to complex planning matters, you probably always need to be starting a process with a planning consultant, and certainly one that's chartered. When it comes to more simple matters, you probably don't need a planning consultant involved. You can rest on your plan drawer, your architect, your builder to guide you through the system in the most appropriate way, because you'll only need to sub us on if things start going wrong.
Yes.
You treat us like a super sub rather than you treating us like a player. But when you're dealing, it all comes down to your need. Often we like to get involved on complex cases as early as humanly possible. I'm dealing with a rather lovely prior approval process down in 𝗍𝗲𝗻 at the moment, where we've encouraged them to get us involved as soon as possible rather than late, because after an architect's already drawn a set of drawings, after an architect's already set the mindset of the applicant, sounds a bit wrong, doesn't it? But you do that. An architect draws a set of drawings and the applicant looks at those drawings and falls in love with them, and then that's pretty much it. That is where we're off to.
Yes.
And then it's our job to try and unpick all of that. Whereas actually, if we can get involved earlier and sort of set with the architect what we're going to be looking at here, then we often get a much better scheme out of it. So on things like that, we like to be involved earlier rather than later, and not just leave it to our architect or architectural technician, an applicant or builder or what have you. There are certain moments where I just wish we were involved as soon as possible. Normally when a builder turns around and says, you know what, you can do it this way and it will be cheaper and you'll get more out of it. I've been dealing with some enforcement cases where I've looked at it and gone, well, I can't save that, because a builder has advised a client post initial planning and during build to change what's going on to the extent that it, say, takes it outside of permitted development, or it pushes it beyond the pale, and it's something that a planning authority could never approve. And you're at that stage, you're probably a bit too late to be giving us a phone call. You're actually probably more over needing a solicitor than you are a planning consultant, and try and get you out of that one.
And when we talked about prior approval and permitted development, the two are not the same, although sometimes in language people mix them up.
They're the same and different all at the same time. They come from the same place. So basic permitted development rights for houses, which is what we normally associate with permitted development, albeit house to HMO is also PD, comes from Class A, Part 1, Schedule 2, Part 1, Schedule 2 of the General Permitted Development Order, or Part 3, Schedule 2 of the General Permitted Development Order. Prior approval habitually lives in the same places. Household or prior approval, larger home extension, additional floor, that's Part 1. Most of the major changes of use, office to resi, Class MA, is Part 3. So it lives inside the same document. It's just they're used differently. So the difference between the two, they're both permitted development rights, but they're used differently. So a basic permitted development right that doesn't require a prior approval process can just be used. A prior approval permitted development right has a process built into it where you must ask for prior approval from a council through a prior notification application, and that must be lodged with them for a certain period of time, commonly 56 days.
So, for example, if someone's put in a small extension on the back of a residential dwelling, say 3-meter extension, that's permitted development.
That's permitted development.
It means you don't need to even notify the local authority you're doing it. You need to comply with the building regs, and you just crack on and get it done.
You just knock on.
No paperwork required as such.
That's right.
But where let's say, for example, it's a shop with uppers that's been converted to a couple of apartments that don't currently exist, that would require a prior approval process, meaning you have to submit, this is what we are proposing to do.
That's right.
And we should be able to do it under this process.
Yeah, and it gives the council the ability to assess the application under the very specific and stringent bandwidths that they have to work with. It's very inflexible on them as well as being inflexible on you. So the one you're talking about is a Class G Part 3. So Class G is 2 flats above a shop, where it's 1 planning unit. The material considerations are flood risk, hilariously, because it's first floor and above. Ground contamination, again, hilariously, because it's first floor. The location of bins, noise and compliance with the national standards. Those are the things the council is allowed to think about. It's not allowed to deviate from those particulars. I've got an appeal running against Croydon Council at the moment where they confused a class G for a class MA and determined a G based on the criteria for MA.
Okay.
We've gone for costs because obviously they haven't even determined the app correctly.
Yes. So when you say going for costs, just a clarification for somebody listening who may not be aware what that means, it means the costs that you are incurring in going to appeal and challenging it.
That's right.
You'll not only recover all those costs from the local authority.
Yes, but only the costs in mounting the appeal. So our fees, for example, or any other professional fees were you to incur them to mount the appeal, can then be claimed back from the council if you succeed in getting an award of appeal costs through the appeals process.
And in terms of making appeal, that doesn't have any impact whether you apply for costs or not, the way it's assessed.
They're assessed as two separate matters. So the appeal is assessed as an appeal and the costs award is assessed against the cost parameters, whether the council have made a systemic or a decision-making failure in determining the application in the first instance.
Do you think that has any ramifications back on the local authorities that just kind of shrug their shoulders at them?
It is a sad case that all local authorities must carry a budget, a lump sum for the payment of fines.
Right.
It doesn't even hit the planning officer.
Right. Okay.
It's just we lost costs, bugger.
Yeah. Okay. So it doesn't really impact the planning office anyway. Hence, their default position of being no is much more easier for them to go with. We were talking off camera about prior approval and prior notification on the assumption that actually by sending it in you think that's it, it's done, slam dunk. But actually that isn't the case because they can get refused as well.
They absolutely can. They absolutely can. They're not a given. They never have been a given, albeit that they're held up by what I like to describe as the guru verse as a given. They're not given. And councils will play the game. So they will absolutely make an attempt. I won an appeal against Stoke City Council a few years ago where Stoke refused to register a prior approval. They just refused to register it. And they were refusing to register it because they wanted information they weren't entitled to have.
Right.
I just turned around and said, well, you're not entitled to have it. And I said, yes, we are. Go read the regs. Oh, no, we're still going to ask for it. You're going to register? No. All right, then. See you in 56 days. 56 days later, I've given them fair warning. I'll be seeing you again in 56 days. 56 days later, you're over time. Oh, but we asked you for information. Take us to appeal. All right then, I'll take you to appeal. Inspector turns around to Stoke and says, you were wholly misguided in what you thought you could and could not do. You got this wrong. Award of appeal costs against you.
Yes.
And grant of permission. But that took an appeal to get there. That's the thing with prior approval. It's not an instant win.
Yes.
And it is subject to change. It is subject to tweaks. We had a whole sequence, didn't we, of prior approval not having to comply with the national standard. And then prior approval did have to comply with the national standard.
That is, for example, size of a minimum size of apartment. And
and that was a major structural shift in prior approval that appeared overnight that then started to affect people's development aspirations.
Yes, because someone less viable.
Yeah. It was put in for good reason. It was put in because, amongst other things, there was someone who did 9 square metre flats in Camden.
Wow.
But to give you a comparison, the statutory size of a prison cell in a Category A prison is 12 square metres.
Oh, wow. Okay. Gosh.
So 3 by 3 is 9 square metres.
Yes.
Probably no bigger than...
Yes, you can almost touch the either sides of the wall without moving in from the middle.
Yeah.
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 Wow.
And their argument was they'd seen it occur in Japan and thought it could happen in England.
Okay. So in terms of the changes that prior approval, etc., we've been seeing over the last few years, things like, for example, you can add an additional story to a terraced property. You can take a roof off a bungalow, insert another floor in between, stick the roof back in. We've not seen, well, I haven't seen any of these type of developments happening around us. Have you seen these type of developments? Are they just not happening, or?
Incredibly sporadically.
Yeah.
I've done a couple, but they've been incredibly sporadic, and for good reason.
Yes, and that's what I was going to ask. What's the challenges in them not happening? Is it a case of actually the delivery of it, structurally being able to make those changes? Is it there's too many requirements that need to be met?
Well, let's start with the buildings that are targeted first. So all of these are targeted to buildings that were built post 1948. So your reasonably structurally sound Victorian terraced house, which makes up the vast proportion of houses in England, taken out of the equation.
Yes, and the reason for that is because building regs sort of started around that sort of time or something in 1948?
It was more to placate amenity bodies. Again, Tory changes to the system are always hamstrung. So it was to placate amenity bodies like the Victorian Society, the Georgian Society, who didn't want to see new floors added to rather pretty buildings. So you can understand with the hamstringing that always occurs on that side of the Commons, that they were being held back. But when you actually then look at buildings that are compatible, buildings built in the 60s, 70s, structurally speaking, those buildings are broadly incompatible with the permitted development right. So they are typically made out of precast concrete with structurally reinforced or tensile reinforcing bars inside the concrete itself. So actually cutting through all of that is incredibly difficult. The building regulations information tends to be incredibly sporadic. I dealt with one through a planning permission in West Byfleet many years ago. I was speaking to the structural engineer on how we were going to this was actually going to happen. And he said, well, I don't know, because I'm dealing with a 1950s building, but the information I can get from building control doesn't tell me what tensile factor tensile strength they put on this rebar. I don't know how much it's tensioned by. So you could cut through this rebar and shoot it through the side of the building because you don't know how much force is on that reinforcing bar. And there we ended up having to wrap the building in an exoskeleton, getting planning permission to wrap the building in an exoskeleton so we could put a new couple of floors on top of it. Because he simply didn't know the unknown. And it was too much of a risk to the building to just uncover a rebar and chop it and see, well, what happened to it. Too much of a risk. So those type of buildings, which you would think are actually really compatible, aren't, because of the unknowns inside of the building itself. We only have really good building regulation information from about the 80s on what the building's actually made out of. But at that time, we weren't building very good buildings. We were building buildings that are, say, steel or spandrel panel. So they don't have much of a structural component to them apart from their steel frame. So what do you then end up putting the new floors on top of? And most of those buildings are covered by covenant anyway. So when it came to the government bringing this forward, I could see what they were trying to do, but it was almost like they hadn't thought about the building that would actually fit it. And that's why they're so sporadic.
And do you think it was just ill thought through when they made these available? Because there was a sense of excitement within the property community at the time.
There was.
And then it's, we could do all these things. And but actually, then you start looking, maybe it's not so practical.
Yeah, I mean, that was it. It was, yes, you can do all these things, but what building can you actually attach it to? I often jest that it was almost as if the Secretary of State was sitting in the bar at the House of Commons, which overlooks the Thames. And he was looking over the Thames to the South Bank, and he was looking at the 1960s tower blocks on the South Bank, which are opposite the Thames next to County Hill. And he was looking at them going, we could put a couple of stories on that and look right. Might help our housing association out. And then he rang Jenkins at DCLG and said, Jenkins, would you mind awfully writing me a permitted development right, please? Doing the consultation, do all of that good stuff. It was almost as if that happened because it was almost written for city centres and those 1960s, 1970s flat roof blocks. And when you read through the right, that's almost what you're picturing in your head, a flat roof block, even to the extent where they go to say, if you've got machinery on the block roof as the lift housing and everything else, you're allowed to breach the 2-storey limit and put that on top to extend the lift core up.
Inserting in,
So it's almost like the building was, the right was written for the building. And then DCLG went, well, okay, great, we've done this. Now what do we do with it? Release it, let's see what happens. And the answer is not much.
So before we start wrapping up, Jon, tell me, what's your thoughts on where you see the opportunities over the next year to 2 years?
Okay, so the biggest thing that I think is going to change structurally inside of planning is the restoration of the national mandatory housing targets. That was something eroded away by the Tory backbench.
So they just scrapped the idea.
They just scrapped the idea.
Stop counting because it's not working.
It's not working. But regrettably, what happens when you remove a target? You take your foot off the accelerator. There's no need to chase after anything anymore. You just take your foot off. So that's proposed to be restored. Now, if it is restored, and restored to the extent that Labour suggests they're going to restore it, then that's going to put more than a third of authorities in a position where they desperately need to find housing. And that, for me, changes the impetus behind the higher-ups in any council. They're suddenly faced with a reality where they're then responsible for finding the housing for that council area, and where do we find it from? The chief exec of East Hampshire, district council in Hampshire, in Hampshire, has done a hilarious open letter, and I read it all the way through. I was like, Angela is going to read this and just laugh. Angela Rayner, that is the Secretary of State. He's written a lovely letter to Angela Rayner and Keir Starmer, explaining why it's unfair that East Hampshire has to find 30% more housing because half of East Hampshire is covered by the South Downs National Park. He forgets to mention that in the part of East Hampshire that he's got to play with, you've got part of the Portsmouth conurbation, Petersfield, which is a major town, and Alton, which is a major town, right? Oh, and they've built a new town at Borden. So he's failed to mention any of that, but he's very upset that he's having to find new housing. I think that is going to be quite telling as to how councils react to that. Certainly the councils around Birmingham, which have always habitually struggled. Most of them fell into presumption last year. So that, I think, is a big opportunity waiting to happen. The biggest thing that will come from that is the reinforcement of the presumption in favour of sustainable development and hope for the appearance of the brownfield passporting that we talked about earlier. If that changes the mindset of planning officers from I must approve this, from I don't have to approve this if I don't want to I must approve this, the presumption is that I will approve. It's a yes first, not a maybe. Then that really is start of a reasonably big change. The other thing I would say to anyone is, and it comes back to my sort of diatribe earlier on, using the resources that we have. Every planning policy that we have on the books today, all the changes that they're proposing tomorrow, and when they come forward, are all focusing our attention on the same thing, which is use the resources that we have. There are many, many, many vacant buildings, vacant spaces in our towns and cities that are underutilised, not utilised, vacant, dead. Let's use them. You will find a planning authority looking at you favourably because you are doing what they ask you to do. You're not fighting, you're cooperating. And when you've got a difficult system, sometimes compliance is the key. So start to comply, start to play with the system and use it in the way it's meant to be used. The final thing I would say, as the thing that I think developers often miss, is once you've done a development, showcase it. Show the councillors what you've done. Show the councillors how you've made their town better.
Yes.
Invite them in. Just going back to what you did with their former head of service at Birmingham, and what I know some of my clients have done in Medway. Invite them in. They never get to see the end result.
Yes.
And you might actually find that their attitude towards you as a developer alters as a result. They don't want to be having to go back to a development after the effects and trying to sort things out or figure things out or do any of that. What they want to do is get things done so that they can move on to the next thing. They will never see the end result. Show them. There's a weird view in the world, and that is a planning consultant or an architect that works in the authority has a fantastic relationship with that authority and can somehow magically make things happen. I'm not a magician. I'm just a planner. You know, I know I appeared in a book a few years ago as Harry Potter's fatter cousin. But that is just how I was described then. In reality, it's the developer that does the job. It's the developer that gains a reputation for themselves. And what you want is a good reputation with that planning authority. They want to be able to trust you with projects. So foster that trust, have that conversation, build that dialogue, invite them back, show them. They never get to see. I bet you will change their attitude towards you if you do.
Yes, that's fantastic advice, that. Jon, I've really enjoyed this conversation. This is certainly my most favourite topic because I see just huge opportunities by just understanding this space. If somebody wants to reach out to you and connect with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
Easy. Dive on the website, tpexpert.org. Dive on the website. You'll find an amazing amount of resources on the website. We've got a whole section called Planningology, which is old appeal decisions, terms of reference, general permitted development order guides. It's all there. It's all free. There's no login. There's no sign up. Just go use and abuse. So we've got that whole section there. They can book services through that website as well. But head to the website first. All of our information is there and it's updated regularly.
Excellent. Jon, thank you so much. Much
You're very
appreciated.
welcome.
Thank you.